There is a single fact about the water crisis in the American West so stark, so almost impossible to believe, that once you understand it, you can never quite see the situation the same way again. The two largest reservoirs in the United States, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the twin giants that store the water of the mighty Colorado River and sustain the lives of tens of millions of people, are together holding less water today than the system held back in 1957. And here is what makes that fact so staggering, so genuinely shocking. In 1957, Lake Powell did not even exist. The second of these two great reservoirs had not yet been created. The dam that would form it had not yet been built. So when we say the two reservoirs together hold less than they did in 1957, we are saying something almost paradoxical, that two reservoirs combined are storing less water than a single reservoir did, back before the second one was ever filled. The system has, in effect, lost so much water that it has fallen below the level it stood at before half of it existed. Let that sink in for a moment, because it is the key to understanding just how deep this crisis has become. For decades, the story of water in the West was a story of building, of adding capacity, of creating ever more storage to capture and hold the river's flow. The great reservoirs were constructed to give the region security, to bank the water of the wet years against the dry ones, to build up an enormous reserve that would carry the desert southwest through whatever nature might bring. And for a long time, that reserve grew, the reservoirs filling with water, the region's water security deepening. But now, after years of drought and overuse and a warming climate, that hard-won reserve has drained away to such a degree that the two great reservoirs together hold less than the system did before the second one was even built. All the water banked over generations, all the hard-won security accumulated in the second great reservoir has effectively been erased, and then some. To understand the full meaning of this, we have to go back to the history of these reservoirs and the river they hold. The Colorado River is the lifeline of the desert Southwest. A single river that flows through some of the driest country on the continent and yet sustains a vast civilization, tens of millions of people, enormous cities, and some of the most productive farmland in the nation. For most of its history, the river ran wild, its flow varying wildly from season to season and year to year, sometimes flooding, sometimes shrinking, delivering its water on nature's unpredictable schedule rather than on the schedule of the people who wanted to use it. To make the river usable, to turn its wild and variable flow into a reliable supply, the region built dams, and behind those dams, the reservoirs formed. The first of the two great reservoirs was Lake Mead, created by one of the most famous dams ever built. A colossal structure raised across the river in the years before the mid-century. When that dam was completed and its gates closed, the river backed up behind it, filling the canyons upstream over a period of years until it formed an enormous body of water, the largest reservoir in the country. For a time, Lake Mead was the great store of the Colorado, the single giant reservoir that captured and held the river's water, providing the security that allowed the region to grow. Through the years around the middle of the century, including the year 1957, Lake Mead was the primary storage of the system, holding the water that the region depended upon, a vast reserve behind the Great Dam. The second great reservoir, Lake Powell, came later. It was created by another enormous dam built upstream of the first in a project completed in the early part of the 1960s. When that second dam was finished and began to hold back the river, a new reservoir began to form behind it, filling gradually over many years as the water accumulated. This second reservoir was comparable in size to the first, another giant capable of storing an enormous quantity of water, and its creation roughly doubled the storage capacity of the system, adding a second great bank account of water to complement the first. With both reservoirs in place, the region had an immense combined storage, a deep reserve that seemed to guarantee its water security for generations to come. This was the great achievement of the era of dam building, a system with the capacity to store vast quantities of water and to buffer the region against even severe and prolonged drought. But in 1957, none of that second reservoir existed. The dam that would create Lake Powell had not yet been built. The upstream canyons that would eventually be flooded to form the second great reservoir were still dry land, a river running through a deep canyon rather than a vast lake. So the storage of the system in 1957 consisted essentially of Lake Mead alone, the single reservoir holding whatever water it contained at that time. And that is the benchmark, the measuring stick against which the current crisis is being compared. The combined storage of both great reservoirs today has fallen below the level that the single reservoir held in that year, before the second reservoir was ever created. Two giants together now hold less than one giant did back then. How is this possible? How could a system with twice the capacity, two great reservoirs instead of one, end up holding less water than the single reservoir did decades ago? The answer lies in the relentless imbalance between what the river has been delivering and what the region has been taking, an imbalance that has drained the reservoirs over many years of decline. The fundamental problem is that the region has been using more water than the river provides, drawing down the reserves to make up the difference year after year, so that the stored water has steadily dwindled. When more water is withdrawn than flows in, the reservoirs fall, and when this continues for many years, the accumulated reserve, however vast, is gradually depleted. The two great reservoirs, which once held an enormous combined store of water, have been drawn down so far by this persistent deficit that their combined contents have fallen below the pre-Powell benchmark. Two forces have driven this depletion, and understanding both is essential. The first is the long-standing overuse of the river. The fact that the water was divided up and promised to the various users on the basis of an assumption about the river's flow that turned out to be too generous. More water was allocated than the river could reliably provide, so that even in normal times, the demands pressed against and often exceeded the supply, requiring the reserves to be tapped. The second force is the drought, the extended dry period that has gripped the region, reducing the river's flow well below normal for years on end, deepening the deficit and accelerating the drainage of the reservoirs. Together, these two forces, chronic overuse and severe drought, have combined to draw the great reservoirs down at an alarming rate, until their combined storage has reached the shocking low that the comparison to 1957 reveals. And there is a third factor lurking behind the drought, one that makes the crisis even more troubling, which is the warming of the climate. As temperatures rise, the effects ripple through the entire water system in ways that reduce the river's flow beyond what reduced precipitation alone would explain. Higher temperatures increase evaporation, pulling water directly from the surfaces of the reservoirs into the air, a loss that grows as the region warms. They cause more of the precipitation that falls to be absorbed by thirsty soils or evaporated before it can reach the river. They cause the mountain snowpack that feeds the river to melt earlier and less completely. The warming acts as an amplifier, intensifying the drought and reducing the river's flow, and because it is a long-term trend rather than a passing phase, it suggests that the low flows may represent a lasting new condition rather than a temporary misfortune, which would mean that the depletion of the reservoirs is not a passing crisis, but a durable new reality. The comparison to 1957 is so powerful because it strips away all the complexity and reduces the crisis to a single, undeniable image. We can talk about acre-feet and percentages and elevations, about the technical measures of the reservoir's decline, but these numbers can wash over us without registering their true meaning. The comparison to 1957 cuts through all of that. It says in the simplest possible terms that the entire system, both great reservoirs combined, now holds less water than existed before half the system was built. It is a way of making the abstract concrete, of conveying the depth of the loss in a form that anyone can grasp. All the storage added by the second great reservoir, all the water banked over decades, has effectively vanished. And the system has fallen below the level it stood at in an era that now seems impossibly distant. What makes this even more sobering is what it implies about the trajectory of the crisis. The fact that the combined storage has fallen below the pre-Powell level is not just a milestone, a shocking statistic to be noted and moved past. It is a sign of a system in profound distress, a reserve that has been drawn down close to the limits of what remains, a warning that the buffer which was supposed to protect the region has been nearly exhausted. The great reservoirs were built to provide security, to hold enough water to carry the region through hard times. And the fact that they have fallen so low means that security is largely gone. The system is operating without the deep reserve that once protected it, closer to the edge, more vulnerable to whatever the coming years may bring. If the decline continues, if the river keeps delivering less than the region takes, then the reservoirs will fall further still, into territory even more dangerous, toward the thresholds where the entire system begins to fail. Those thresholds are the reason the low storage is not merely a symbolic concern, but a genuine emergency. As the reservoirs fall, they approach levels at which the system can no longer function as it was designed to. At certain levels, the generation of electricity at the great dams is threatened. Because the production of power depends on the water being high enough to drive the machinery, and the electricity from these dams serves a great many people. At even lower levels lies the ultimate catastrophe, the point at which water can no longer pass through a dam at all, cutting off the flow to the users downstream. The depletion of the reservoirs to below the pre-Powell level means the system is operating with a dangerously thin margin above these critical thresholds, and every further decline brings it closer to the point where the machinery of the whole system begins to break down. Consider what is at stake. The water stored in these two great reservoirs sustains tens of millions of people across multiple states, providing the water that fills their taps, that irrigates the farms growing their food, that supports the cities and industries where they live and work. Great desert cities have grown to enormous size on the strength of this water. Vast expanses of farmland, some of the most productive in the nation, depend entirely on the water delivered from the system. All of this rests on the water held in the reservoirs, and the fact that the combined storage has fallen below the pre-Powell benchmark means that the foundation of all this life and activity has been eroded to a degree that would have been unthinkable in the era when the reservoirs were built and filled. The security that the great storage was supposed to provide has been drawn down to a fraction of what it was, leaving the region exposed as never before. The comparison to 1957 also carries a deeper lesson about the false confidence that comes from building capacity without ensuring a sustainable supply. When the second great reservoir was built and the system's storage capacity was roughly doubled, it must have seemed that the region's water security was assured for generations, that so vast a reserve could never be exhausted. The building of ever more storage created a sense of abundance, a confidence that the water would always be there. But capacity is not the same as supply, and a reservoir, however large, is only as full as the water flowing into it allows it to be. Building a bigger bank account does not help if you are withdrawing more than you deposit. And that, in essence, is what the region has been doing. The vast capacity of the two great reservoirs gave a false sense of security, masking the underlying imbalance between supply and demand, and now that the reserves have been drawn down, the illusion has been shattered, and the true, precarious state of the system revealed. There is something almost poetic and deeply cautionary in the image of two reservoirs holding less than one once did. It captures, in a single comparison, the way that human beings can build and build, can add capacity and create the appearance of security, while all the while drawing down the underlying resource faster than it can be replenished. The region built two of the largest reservoirs in the world, an extraordinary feat of engineering, and yet it now finds itself with less water than it had before the second one existed. Because the fundamental problem was never the lack of storage, but the excess of demand and the decline of supply. No amount of storage capacity can solve a problem of taking more than nature provides, and the fall of the combined storage below the pre-Powell level is the proof of that hard truth, written across the two great reservoirs of the Colorado. There is a further dimension to the crisis that the comparison to 1957 helps illuminate, which is the way the two reservoirs are linked together as a single system. Lake Mead and Lake Powell do not operate in isolation. The upstream reservoir Powell captures the water flowing down from the higher part of the watershed and releases it downstream to Mead, which in turn delivers it to the users below. The two are managed together, the water moved between them according to the rules that govern the system. This means that the health of the whole depends on both, and that the decline of one affects the other. When the upstream reservoir falls low, there is less water to release downstream, which can accelerate the decline of the lower reservoir. and when both fall together, as they have, the entire linked system approaches its limits at once. The combined storage figure, the number that has fallen below the level of 1957, is the truest measure of the system's health precisely because it captures both reservoirs together, the total reserve available to the entire region. And that total, the sum of everything held in both great reservoirs, has dropped below what a single one held before the other was built, a measure not of one reservoir's trouble, but of the whole system's distress. The linkage that was meant to give the system flexibility and resilience now means that both giants are falling together. Their combined decline, reflecting a crisis that touches every part of the interconnected whole. So what happens now, and can anything be done? The situation is dire, but it is not entirely hopeless, because there are responses that can slow the decline and perhaps stabilize the system, though they require difficult sacrifices. The most fundamental is to reduce the demand for water, to bring the total use into line with what the river can actually provide. Closing the deficit that has drained the reservoirs. This means using less water across every sector that depends on it, improving the efficiency of irrigation, which consumes the largest share, reducing the cultivation of the most water-intensive crops, encouraging conservation in the cities, and finding ways to accomplish more with less. It means managing the system to reduce the losses to evaporation and inefficiency, and it means the difficult work of reaching agreement among the many users on how to share the reduced supply, distributing the necessary cuts in a way that all can accept. But these responses face enormous challenges, and there is no guarantee they will be sufficient to reverse the decline. Reducing demand means imposing real sacrifices on people and industries and communities that depend on the water. And the difficulty of deciding who must use less and by how much is immense, a source of intense conflict among the users who share the river. And even the most vigorous reductions in demand must contend with the possibility that the supply will keep shrinking, that the warming will continue to reduce the river's flow, so that the target keeps moving and the reductions achieved are overtaken by further declines. The challenge is not merely to refill a depleted reserve, but to stabilize a system whose supply may continue to fall, and that is a far harder and more open-ended task. One that may require not a one-time adjustment, but a permanent transformation in how the region uses its water. The fall of the combined storage below the level of 1957 is, in the end, a warning of the most serious kind, a sign that the water system of the desert Southwest has been drawn down to a perilous state, that the great reserves built up over generations have been nearly exhausted, and that the region faces a reckoning it can no longer avoid. It is a warning that the era of abundance, the era in which the reservoirs were built and filled and the water seemed inexhaustible, is over, and that the region must now confront the reality of scarcity, of a river that can no longer meet the demands placed upon it, of a future that must be built on a foundation of less. The comparison to a year before the second reservoir existed is a way of measuring just how far the region has fallen, how completely the accumulated security has drained away, how urgent the need for change has become. And the lesson reaches beyond the Colorado, beyond the desert Southwest, to anyone who would understand the relationship between human demands and natural limits. The story of the two great reservoirs holding less than one once did is a story about the danger of building on the assumption of endless abundance, of trusting in capacity and engineering to guarantee a security that ultimately depends on the natural supply. It is a story about what happens when a society takes more than nature can provide, drawing down its reserves faster than they can be replenished, until the accumulated buffer is exhausted and the true precariousness of the situation is exposed. As the climate warms and water grows scarcer in many parts of the world, the lesson of Mead and Powell, of the two reservoirs that now hold less than one did before the second was built, is a lesson that many regions may come to learn. A warning written in the falling waters of the Colorado about the limits that no amount of engineering can escape. The great reservoirs stand today far below their old high water marks, their bathtub rings towering above the shrunken surfaces, their combined contents fallen below the level of an era before half of them existed. It is a haunting image and a haunting fact, and it should command the attention of everyone who depends on the water of the Colorado. which is to say tens of millions of people across the American Southwest. The system that was built to provide security has been drained to the edge of crisis, and the comparison to 1957 is the starkest possible measure of how far it has fallen. Whether the region can respond, whether it can bring its demands into line with what the river provides, and stabilize the system before it collapses, remains to be seen. But the warning could not be clearer or more urgent. 2 reservoirs now hold less than one once did. The accumulated abundance of generations has drained away, and the time to act before the great system falls further